Section 10 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by Arthur Griffiths. Section 10. In London, various places have been used for the scene of execution. The spot where a murder had been committed was often appropriately selected as the place of retribution. Execution Dock was reserved for pirates and sea robbers, Tower Hill for persons of rank who were beheaded. Gallows for meaner malefactors were sometimes erected on the latter place, the right to do so being claimed by the city. In the reign of Edward IV, however, there was a conflict of authority between the king and the corporation on this point. The king's officer set up a scaffold and gallows on Tower Hill, whereupon the mayor and his brethren complained to the king, who replied that he had not acted in derogation of the city liberties, and caused public proclamation to be made that the city exercised certain rights on Tower Hill. Executions also took place, according to Pennant, at the Standard in Cheap. 3 men were beheaded there for rescuing a prisoner, and in 1351 2 fishmongers for some unknown crime. Smithfield had long the dismal honour of witnessing the death throes of offenders. Between Hosier and Cow Lanes was anciently a large pool called Smithfield Pond, or Horse Pool, from the watering of horses there. To the south-west lay St. John's Court, and close to it the public gallows on the town green. There was a clump of trees in the centre of the green, elms, from which the place of execution was long euphemistically called the Elms. It was used as such early in the 13th century, and distinguished persons, William Fitz Osbert, Mortimer, and Sir William Wallace, suffered here. About 1413 the gibbet was removed from Smithfield and put up at the north end of a garden wall belonging to St. Giles's Leper Hospital, opposite the Pound, where the Crown Tavern is at present situate, between the end of St. Giles High Street and Hog Lane. But Smithfield must have still been used after the transfer of the gallows to St. Giles. In 1580 another conflict of jurisdiction, this time between the city and the lieutenant of the Tower. A gibbet was erected in that year in East Smithfield, at Hog Lane, for the execution of one R. Dodd, who had murdered a woman in those parts. But when the sheriff brought the malefactor there to be hanged, Sir Owen Hopton, the lieutenant of the Tower, commanded the sheriff's officers back again to the west side of a cross that stood there, and which probably marked the extent of the liberties of the Tower. Discussion followed. The sheriffs, with their prisoner, accompanied the lieutenant into a house to talk it over, whence after a good stay they all departed. The city gave way, the gibbet was taken down, and the malefactor carried to Tyburn in the same afternoon, where he was executed. The gallows were no doubt all ready for the business, for Tyburn had been used for executions as long as Smithfield. There were elms also at Tyburn, hence a not uncommon confusion between the two places of execution. Tyburn has been ingeniously derived from the two words Ty and Bourne, the last a bourne or resting place for prisoners who were taken bound. Pennant gives the derivation Ty, the name of a brook or bourne which flowed through it. In Lofty's History of London he points out that the Tyburn of earliest times was a bleak heath situated at the end of the Marylebone Lane as we know it, and which, as it approached the town, had 2 branches. He suggests that the brook or bourne also divided into 2, hence the name Teo Burn, or 2 streams. Mr. Waller gives the same derivation, and in one of the earliest mentions of the Tyburn, an ancient chapter at Westminster, dated 951, it is called Teoburn. There were many Tyburns, however, and as in London the gallows were moved farther and farther westward of the building of houses, so the name of Tyburn travelled from Marylebone Lane to Edgware Road. As time passed on it came to be the generic name for all places of execution, and was used at York, Liverpool, Dublin, and elsewhere. Tyburn was a kind of Golgotha, a place of infamy and disgrace. When Colonel Blood seized the Duke of Ormond in St. James's Street, it was with the avowed intention of carrying him to Tyburn, there to be hanged like a common criminal. The exact position of the Tyburn gallows has been a matter of some controversy. Mr. Robbins places the Elms Lane as the first turning to the right in the Uxbridge Road after getting into it from the Grand Junction Road opposite the Serpentine. In Smith's History of Marylebone he states that the gallows stood on a small eminence at the corner of the Edgware Road, near the turnpike. Other authorities fix the place in Connaught Square, because in the lease of one of the houses, No. 49, granted by the Bishop of London, the fact that the gallows once stood on the site is expressly mentioned in the parchment. It was commonly reported that many human bones were exhumed between Nos. 6 and 12, Connaught Place, as well as in the garden of Arklow House, which stands at the south-west angle of the Edgware Road. But Mr. Lofty states as a matter of fact that no such discovery was ever made. A careful but fruitless search at the time Connaught Place was built produced a single bone, probably part of a human jawbone, but nothing more. As to Arklow House, the report is distinctly denied by the owner himself. It is, however, pretty certain that at a later date the gallows were kept at a house at the corner of Upper Bryanston Street and the Edgware Road, in front of which they were erected when required. A detailed account has been preserved of the execution of Colonel John Turner in 1662, which presents a strange picture of the way in which the extreme penalty of the law was carried out in those days. The scene of the execution was not Tyburn, but a place in Leadenhall Street, at Lime Street End, a spot near the place where the deed for which Turner suffered was perpetrated. An immense crowd had gathered, as usual, to witness the convict's death. Pepys was there, of course, as he tells us, "and after sending my wife to my Aunt Wright's, to get a place to see Turner hanged, I to change." On his way he met people flocking to the place of execution, and mingling with the crowd somewhere about St. Mary Axe, "got to stand upon the wheel of a cart for a shilling, in great pain above an hour before the execution was done, he delaying the time by long discourses and prayers, one after another, in hopes of a reprieve, but none came." Turner was drawn in a cart from Newgate at 11 in the morning, accompanied by the ordinary and another minister with the sheriffs, keeper of the gaol, and other officials in attendance. On coming to the gibbet he called the executioner to him, and presented him with money in lieu of his clothes, which his friends desired to keep. Then, standing in the cart, he addressed the crowd with great prolixity. He dwelt on the cardinal sins, he gave a circumstantial account of his birth, parentage, family history. He detailed his war services as a loyal cavalier, with his promotions and various military rewards. With much proper feeling he sought to lessen the blame attached to his accomplices in the murder, and to exonerate the innocent accused. At intervals in this long discourse he was interrupted now by the sheriffs with broad hints to dispatch, now by the ordinary as to the irrelevance and impropriety of such remarks from a man about to die. Again the keeper of Newgate taxed him with other crimes, saying, for example, "Pray, Colonel Turner, do you know nothing of a glass jewel delivered to the Countess of Devonshire in room of another?" Or, "How about the fire in Lothbury, or the mysterious death of your namesake Turner, who died in your house?" The condemned man discoursed at great length upon these various points, and was again and again reminded that it would be better for him to prepare for his approaching end. Still he continued his harangue, and took a new departure when he remembered the condition of the condemned hold of Newgate, into which he had been cast after coming from the sessions. This hole, as it was called, he characterizes as "a most fearful, sad, deplorable place. Hell itself in comparison cannot be such a place. There is neither bench, stool, nor stick for any person there. They lie like swine upon the ground, one upon another, howling and roaring. It was more terrible to me than this death. I would humbly beg that hole may be provided with some kind of boards, like a court of guard, that a man may lie down upon them in ease, for when they should be best prepared for their ends, they are most tormented. They had better take them and hang them as soon as they have their sentence." This aspersion, however, on this part of his gaol, the keeper tried to refute by stating that 17 out of the 19 poor wretches confined in the hole managed to escape from it. But the reprieve for which Turner looked in vain still tarried. He was obliged now to fall to his prayers. These, by the Christian charity of the officials, he was permitted to spin out as long as he pleased. Then he went through the ceremony of distributing alms money for the poor, money for his wife to be passed on to his young son's schoolmaster. At last he directed the executioner to take the halter off his shoulders, and afterwards, "taking it in his hands, he kissed it, and put it on his neck himself. Then after he had fitted the cap, and put it on, he went out of the cart up the ladder." The executioner fastened the noose, and, "pulling the rope a little, says Turner, 'What, dost thou mean to choke me? Pray, fellow, give me more rope. What a simple fellow is this! How long have you been executioner that you know not how to put the knot?'" At the very last moment, in the midst of some private ejaculations, espying a gentlewoman at a window nigh, he kissed his hand, saying, "Your servant, mistress," and so he was "turned off," as Pepys says of him. "A comely looking man he was, and kept his countenance to the last. I was sorry to see him. It was believed there were at least 12 or 14,000 people in the street." There was nothing new in this desire to gloat over the dying agonies of one's fellow creatures. The Roman matron cried "habet," and turned down her thumb when the gladiator dispatched his prostrate foe. Great dignitaries and high-born dames have witnessed without a shudder the tortures of an auto da fe. To this day it is the fashion for delicately nurtured ladies to flock to the law courts, and note the varying emotions, from keenest anguish to most brutal sang-froid, of notorious murderers on trial. It is not strange, then, that in uncultivated and comparatively demoralized ages the concourse about the gallows should be great, or the conduct of the spectators riotous, brutal, often heartless in the extreme. There was always a rush to see an execution. The crowd was extraordinary when the sufferers were persons of note, or had been concerned in any much talked of case. Thus all London turned out to stare at the hanging of Vratz, Borowski, and Stern, convicted of the murder of Mr. Thynne, of which Count Königsmarck had been acquitted. The execution took place in 1682 on the gallows which had been set up in Pall Mall, the scene of the crime. Many hundreds of standings were taken up by persons of quality and others. The Duke of Monmouth, one of the most intimate friends of the murdered man, was among the spectators in a balcony close by the gallows, and was the cynosure of every eye, fixing the glance of even one of the convicts, Captain Vratz, who stared at him fixedly till the drop fell. The fashion of gazing at these painful exhibitions grew more and more popular. Horace Walpole satirizes the vile practice of thus glorifying criminals. "You cannot conceive," he says to Sir Horace Mann, "the ridiculous rage there is of going to Newgate. The prints that are published of the malefactors, and the memoirs of their lives set forth with as much parade as Marshal Turenne." George Selwyn, chief among the wits and beaux of his time, was also conspicuous for his craving of such horrid sights. He was characterized by Walpole as a friend whose passion it was to see coffins, corpses, and executions. Judges going on assize wrote to Selwyn, promising him a good place at all the executions which might take place on their circuits. Other friends kept him informed of approaching events, and bespoke a seat for him, or gave full details of the demeanour of those whose sufferings he had not been privileged to see. Thus Henry St. John writes to tell him of the execution of Waistcott, Lord Huntington's butler, for burglary, which he attended with his brother at the risk of breaking their necks, "by climbing up an old rotten scaffolding, which I feared would tumble before the cart drove off with the 6 malefactors." St. John goes on to say that he had a full view of Waistcott, "who went to the gallows with a white cockade in his hat as an emblem of his innocence, and died with some hardness, as appeared through his trial." Another correspondent, Gilly Williams, gives additional particulars. "The dog died game, went in the cart in a blue and white frock and white cockade. He ate several oranges on his passage, inquired if his hearse was ready, and then, as old Rowe would say, was launched into eternity." Again, George Townshend, writing to Selwyn from Scotland of the Jacobites, promises him plenty more entertainment on Tower Hill. The joke went round that Selwyn at the dentist's gave the signal for drawing a tooth by dropping his handkerchief, just as people did to the executioner on the scaffold. He would go anywhere to see men turned off. He was present when Lord Lovat was decapitated, and justified himself by saying that he had made amends in going to the undertaker's to see the head sewn on again. So eager was he to miss no sight worth seeing, that he went purposely to Paris to witness the torture of the unhappy Damiens. "On the day of the execution," Jessie tells us, "he mingled with the crowd in a plain undress suit and bob wig, when a French nobleman, observing the deep interest he took in the scene, and imagining from the plainness of his attire that he must be a person in the humbler ranks of life, resolved that he must infallibly be a hangman. 'Eh bien, monsieur,' he said, 'êtes-vous arrivé pour voir ce spectacle?' 'Oui, monsieur.' 'Vous êtes bourreau?' 'Non, monsieur,' replied Selwyn, 'je n'ai pas l'honneur, je ne suis qu'un amateur.'" It was in these days, or a little later, when Newgate became the scene of action, that an execution was made the occasion of a small festivity at the prison. The governor gave a breakfast after the ceremony to some 13 or 14 people of distinction, and his daughter, a very pretty girl, did the honours of the table. According to her account, few did much justice to the viands. The first call of the inexperienced was for brandy, and the only person with a good appetite for her broiled kidneys, a celebrated dish of hers, was the ordinary. After breakfast was over, the whole party adjourned to see the cutting down. That which was a morbid curiosity among a certain section of the upper classes became a fierce, hungry passion with the lower. The scenes upon execution days almost baffle description. Dense crowds thronged the approaches to Newgate, and the streets leading to Tyburn or other places of execution. It was a ribald, reckless, brutal mob, violently combative, fighting and struggling for foremost places, fiercely aggressive, distinctly abusive. Spectators often had their limbs broken, their teeth knocked out, sometimes they were crushed to death. Barriers could not always restrain the crowd, and were often borne down and trampled underfoot. All along the route taken by the procession, people vented their feelings upon the doomed convicts, cheering a popular criminal to the echo, offering him nosegays or unlimited drink, railing and storming on the other hand at those they hated, or, worse still, despised. When Earl Ferrers was hanged, in 1760, the concourse was so great that the procession took 3 hours to travel from Newgate to Tyburn. Lord Ferrers told the sheriff that passing through such a multitude was 10 times worse than death itself. The same brutality was carried to the foot of the gallows. The mob surged around the cart, conversing with the condemned, now encouraging, now upbraiding, anon making him a target for all manner of missiles, and this even at the last awful moment, when the convict was on his knees, wrapped in prayer. A woman named Barbara Spencer was beaten down by a stone when actually in supplication upon her knees. When Jack Sheppard, that most popular but most depraved young criminal, was executed, an incredible number of persons was present. The crowd was unruly enough, even before execution, but afterwards it grew perfectly frantic. When the body had hung the appointed time, an undertaker ventured to appear with a hearse to carry it off, but being taken for a surgeon's man about to remove Jack Sheppard to the dissecting room, he incurred the fierce displeasure of the mob. They demolished the hearse, then fell upon the undertaker, who with difficulty escaped with life. After that they seized the body and carried it off, throwing it from hand to hand, until it was covered with bruises and dirt. It was taken as far as the barley mow in Long Acre, where it lay some hours, and until it was discovered that the whole thing was a trick devised by a bailiff in the pay of the surgeons, and that the body had been forcibly taken from a person who really intended to bury it. The mob was now excited to frenzy, and a serious riot followed. The police being quite inadequate to quell it, the military were called in, and with the aid of several detachments of guards, the ringleaders were secured. The body was given over to a friend of Sheppard's to bury. The mob dispersed to attend it to St. Martin's Fields, where it was deposited under a guard of soldiers, and eventually buried. While these wild revels were kept up both before and after the execution, the demeanour of the doomed partook too often of the general recklessness. The calendars are full of particulars of the manner in which condemned convicts met their fate. Many awaited the extreme penalty and endured it with callous indifference or flippant effrontery. Only now and again did their courage break down at the 11th hour, and so prove that it was assumed. A few notable examples may be cited as exhibiting their various moods. Paul Lewis, once a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, but an irreclaimable scoundrel, who took eventually to the road, and was sentenced to death for highway robbery, was boldly unconcerned after sentence. In Newgate he was the leader of the revels. They dubbed him captain, like Macheath. He sat at the head of the table, swore at the parson, and sang obscene songs. It was not until the warrant of execution arrived at the prison that all bravado evaporated, and he became as abject as he had before appeared hardened. John Rann, the highwayman, better known as 16-string Jack, had a farewell dinner party after he was convicted, and while awaiting execution. The company included 7 girls. "All were remarkable cheerful, nor was Rann less joyous than his companions." Dick Turpin made elaborate preparations for his execution, purchased a new suit of fustian and a pair of pumps to wear at the gallows, and hired 5 poor men at 10 shillings per head to follow his cart as mourners, providing them with hat bands and mourning bands. Nathaniel Parkhurst, who, when in the Fleet for debtors, murdered a fellow prisoner, demolished a roast fowl at breakfast on the morning of his execution, and drank a pint of liquor with it. Jerry Abershaw was persistently callous from first to last. Returning from court across Kennington Common, he asked his conductors whether that was the spot on which he was to be twisted. His last days in the condemned cell he spent in drawing upon the walls with the juice of black cherries designs of the various robberies he had committed on the road. Abershaw's sang-froid did not desert him on the last day. He appeared with his shirt thrown open, a flower in his mouth, and all the way to the gallows carried on an incessant conversation with friends who rode by his side, nodding to others he recognized in the crowd, which was immense. The season was the summer, and on the Sunday following the execution, London was like a deserted city. Hundreds of thousands went out to see him hanging on chains. Still more awful was the conduct of Hannah Dago, a Herculean Irishwoman, who plied the trade of porter at Covent Garden. In Newgate, while under sentence, she was most defiant. She was the terror of her fellow prisoners, and actually stabbed a man who had given evidence against her. When the cart was drawn in under the gallows, she got her arms loose, seized the executioner, struggled with him, and gave him so violent a blow on the chest that she nearly knocked him down. She dared him to hang her, and tearing off her hat, cloak, and other garments, the hangman's perquisites, distributed them among the crowd in spite of him. After a long struggle, he got the rope around her neck. This accomplished, she drew her handkerchief from round her head over her face, and threw herself out of the cart before the signal was given, with such violence that she broke her neck and died instantly. Many ancient customs long retained tended to make them more hardened. Chief among these was the offer of strong drink by the way. When the gallows stood at St. Giles, it was the rule to offer malefactors about to be hanged a great bowl of ale, "as the last refreshment they were to receive in this life." This drink was long known as the St. Giles's bowl. The practice of giving drink was pretty general for years later, and in many parts of the country. In Yorkshire, at Bawtry, so the story runs, a saddler was on his way to be hanged. The bowl was brought out, but he refused it, and went on to his death. Meanwhile his reprieve was actually on the road, and had he lingered to drink, time sufficient would have been gained to save him. Hence came the saying that the saddler of Bawtry was hanged for leaving his ale. Other convicts are mentioned in an uncomplimentary manner because they dared to smoke on the road to the gallows. "Some mad knaves took tobacco all the way as they went to be hanged at Tyburn." This was in 1598, when the use of the weed introduced by Sir Walter Raleigh was still somewhat rare. 100 years later, the misbehaviour was in imprudently calling for sack, and drinking King James's health, after which the convicts affronted the ordinary at the gallows, and refused his assistance. There were few who behaved with the decency and self-possession of Lord Ferrers, who went to his shameful death in a suit of white and silver, that, it is said, in which he had been married. He himself provided the white cap to be pulled over his face, and the black silk handkerchief with which his arms were to be bound. His last words were, "Am I right?" and immediately the drop fell. In his case there had been an unseemly wrangle upon the gallows between the executioner and his assistant. Lord Ferrers had given the latter, in mistake for his chief, a fee of 5 guineas, which the head executioner claimed, and the assistant would not readily surrender. Some were in abject terror till the last act commenced. Thus John Aycliffe, a forger, was in the utmost agonies the night preceding his execution, his agitation producing an intolerable thirst, which he vainly sought to allay by copious draughts of water. Yet his composure quite returned on his road to Tyburn, and he behaved with decency at the fatal tree. It was just the reverse with Mrs. Meteyard, who with her daughter murdered a parish apprentice. She was in a fit when put into the cart, and she continued insensible all the way to Tyburn. Great efforts were made to restore her, but without avail, and she was in an unconscious state when hanged. It may be questioned whether that close attention was paid to the spiritual needs of the condemned which is considered indispensable in these more humane days. No doubt many rejected the offers of the ordinary, refusing to attend chapel, pretending to belong to out-of-the-way persuasions, and still declining the ministrations of clergymen of any creed. Others pretended, like Dean Swift's Tom Clinch, that they went off with a clear conscience and a calm spirit, without prayer book or psalm. But very probably this indifference to the ordinary and his ghostly counsels arose from a suspicion that he was not very earnest in what he said. The Newgate ordinary, although a sound Protestant, was a father confessor to all criminals. Not the least profitable part of his emoluments came from the sale of his account of the execution of convicts, a species of gaol calendar which he compiled from information the condemned men themselves supplied. That the ordinary attached great value to this production is clear from the petition made by one of them, the Reverend Paul Lorraine, to the House of Commons, that his pamphlet might be exempted from the tax levied upon paper. It is easy to understand that the ordinary might have been better employed than in compiling these accounts, however interesting they may be, as illustrating the crime of the last century. It is also pretty certain that, although doubtless blameless and exemplary men, Newgate chaplains were not always overzealous in the discharge of their sacred office in regard to the condemned. There were many grim jokes among the prisoners themselves as to the value of the parson's preaching. Thus, in the Reverend Mr. Cotton's time as ordinary, convicts were said to go out of the world with their ears stuffed full of cotton, and his interpretation of any particular passage in Scripture was said to go in at one ear and out at the other. Hence the intrusion, which must have seemed to them unwarrantable, of dissenting and other amateur preachers, or well-meaning enthusiasts, who devoted themselves with unremitting vigour to the spiritual consolation of all prisoners who would listen to them. It is impossible to speak otherwise than most approvingly of the single-minded, self-sacrificing devotion of such men as Silas Told, the forerunner of Howard, Mrs. Fry, the Gurneys, and other estimable philanthropists. Nevertheless, unseemly polemical wrangles appeared to have been the result of this interference, which was better meant than appreciated by the authorized clerical officer. Dr. Doran, referring to the execution of James Shepherd (Jacobite Shepherd, not Jack), gives an account of a conflict of this kind. "Shepherd's dignity," he says, "was not even ruffled by the renewed combat in the cart of the Newgate chaplain and the non-juror. Each sought to comfort and confound the culprit according to his way of thinking. Once more the messengers of peace got to fisticuffs, but as they neared Tyburn, the non-juror kicked Paul, the ordinary, out of the cart, and kept by the side of Shepherd till the rope was adjusted. There he boldly, as those Jacobite non-jurors were wont, gave the passive lad absolution for the crime for which he was about to pay the penalty, after which he jumped down to have a better view of the sorry spectacle from the foremost ranks of spectators." It was no doubt on account of the insufficiency of the spiritual consolations offered to the condemned that led old Richard Dove, or Dow, to make his endowment for tolling the prisoner's bell. He bequeathed £50 a year for ever, so Stowe tells us, for this philanthropic purpose. When condemned prisoners were being drawn to their executions at Tyburn, a man with a bell stood in the churchyard by St. Sepulchre's, by the wall next the street, and so to put them in mind of their death approaching. Later on these verses took the form of exhortation, of which the following is the substance. "You prisoners that are within, who for wickedness and sin, after many mercies shown you, are now appointed to die tomorrow in the forenoon, give ear and understand that tomorrow morning the greatest bell of St. Sepulchre's shall toll for you, in form and manner of a passing bell, as used to be tolled for those who are at the point of death, to the end that all godly people hearing that bell, and knowing it is for you going to your death, may be stirred up heartily to pray to God to bestow his grace and mercy upon you whilst you live. I beseech you, for Jesus Christ his sake, to keep this night in watching and prayer for the salvation of your own souls, whilst there is yet time and place for mercy, as knowing tomorrow you must appear before the judgment seat of your Creator, there to give an account of all things done in this life, and to suffer eternal torments for your sins committed against him, unless upon your hearty and unfeigned repentance you find mercy, through the merits, death, and passion of your only mediator and advocate, Jesus Christ, who now sits at the right hand of God to make intercession for as many of you as penitently return to him." In times when scaffold and gallows were perpetually crowded, the executioner was a prominent if not exactly a distinguished personage. The office might not be honourable, but it was not without its uses, and the man who filled it was an object of both interest and dread. In some countries the dismal paraphernalia, axe, gibbet, or rack, have been carried by aristocratic families on their arms. The Scotch Dalziels bear sable, a hanged man with his arms extended. A Spanish hidalgo has in his coat armour a ladder with gibbet, and various implements of torture have been borne by German families of distinction. In France the post of executioner was long hereditary, regularly transmitted from father to son for many generations, and enjoyed eventually something of the credit vouchsafed to all hereditary offices. With us the law's finisher has never been held in great esteem. He was on a par rather with the Roman carnifex, an odious official, who was not suffered to live within the precincts of the city. The only man who would condescend to the work was usually a condemned criminal, pardoned for the very purpose. Derrick, one of the first names mentioned, was sentenced to death, but pardoned by Lord Essex, whom he afterwards executed. Next to him I find that one Bull acted as executioner about 1593. Then came Gregory Brandon, the man who is generally supposed to have decapitated Charles I, and who was commonly addressed by his Christian name only. Through an error Brandon was advanced to the dignity of a squire by Garter, King at Arms, and succeeding executioners were generally honoured with the same title. Brandon was followed by his son, young Brandon, by Squire Dunn, who gave place in his turn to John Ketch, the godfather of all modern hangmen. Many of the immediate successors of Brandon above mentioned were called Gregory. Jack Ketch did not give entire satisfaction. It is recorded in Luttrell that Ketch was dispossessed in favour of Pascal Rousse, a butcher, who served only a few months when Ketch was restored. After Ketch, John Price was the man, a pardoned malefactor, who could not resist temptation, and was himself executed for murder by someone else. Dennis, the hangman at the Lord George Gordon riots, had also been sentenced to death for complicity, but obtained forgiveness on condition that he should string up his former associates. They did their work roughly, these early practitioners. Sometimes the rope slipped, or the drop was insufficient, and the hangman had to add his weight, assisted by that of zealous spectators, to the sufferer's legs to effect strangulation. Now and again the rope broke, and the convict had to be tied up a second time. This happened with Captain Kidd, the notorious pirate, who was perfectly conscious during the time which elapsed before he was again tied up. The friends of another pirate, John Gow, were anxious to put him out of his pain, and pulled his legs so hard that the rope broke before he was dead, necessitating the repetition of the whole ceremony. Even when the operation had been successfully performed, the hangman sometimes cheated the gallows. There are several well authenticated cases of resuscitation after hanging, due doubtless to the rude and clumsy plan of killing. To slide off a ladder or drop from a cart might and generally did produce asphyxia, but there was no instantaneous fracture of the vertebral column as in most executions of modern times. The earliest case on record is that of Thyretta de Bolsham, whom Henry III pardoned in 1264, because she had survived hanging. As she is said to have been suspended from one morning till sunrise the following day, it is difficult to believe the story, which was probably one of many medieval impostures. Females, however, appear to have had more such escapes than males. Dr. Ploto gives several instances. One, that of Anne Green, who in 1650 came to when in the hands of the doctors for dissection. Another of Mrs. Cope, hanged at Oxford in 1658, who was suspended for an unusually long period, and afterwards let fall violently, yet she recovered, only to be more effectually hanged next day. A third substantiated case was that of half-hanged Maggie Dixon, who was hanged at Edinburgh in 1728, and whom the jolting of the cart in which her body was removed from the gallows recovered. The jolting was considered so infallible a recipe for bringing to, that it was generally practised by an executed man's friends in Ireland, where also the friends were in the habit of holding up the convict by his waistband after he had dropped, so that the rope should not press upon his throat, the sheriff philanthropically pretending not to see. Sir William Petty, the eminent surgeon in Queen Anne's time, owed his scientific fame to his having resuscitated a woman who had been hanged. The body had been begged, as was the custom, for the anatomical lecture. Petty, finding symptoms of life, bled her, put her to bed with another woman, and gave her spirits and other restoratives. She recovered, whereupon the students subscribed to endow her with a small portion, and she soon after married, and lived for 15 years. The case of half-hanged Smith was about the date 1705. He was reprieved, but the reprieve arrived after he had been strung up. He was taken down, bled, and brought to. Smith afterwards described his sensations minutely. The weight of his body when he first dropped caused him great pain. His spirits forced their way up to his head and seemed to go out at his eyes with a great blaze of light, and then all pain left him. But on his resuscitation, the blood and spirits forcing themselves into their proper channels gave him such intolerable suffering that he could have wished those hanged who cut him down. William Jewell, hanged in 1740, was carried to Surgeons' Hall to be anatomized, but as his body was being laid out, one of the servants who was washing him perceived that he was still alive. A surgeon bled him, and in 2 hours he was able to sit up in his chair. Later in the evening he was sent back to Newgate, and his sentence changed to transportation. In 1767 a man who had hanged for 28 minutes was operated on by a surgeon, who made an incision into the windpipe. In less than 6 hours the hanged man revived. It became a constant practice for a condemned man's friends to carry off the body directly it was cut down to the nearest surgeons, who at once operated on it by bleeding and so forth. The plan was occasionally, but rarely, successful. It was tried with Dr. Dodd, who was promptly carried to an undertaker's in Tottenham Court Road, and placed in a hot bath, but he had been too well hanged for recovery. A report was long current that Fauntleroy the banker, who was executed for forgery, had been resuscitated, but it was quite without foundation. The Tyburn procession survived till towards the end of the 18th century. It had many supporters, Dr. Johnson among the number. "Sir," he told Boswell when Tyburn had been discontinued, "executions are intended to draw spectators. If they do not draw spectators, they do not answer their purpose." The old method was most satisfactory to all parties. The public was gratified by a procession, the criminal is supported by it. Why is all this to be swept away? The reason is given by the sheriffs in the year 1784, and it is convincing. In a pamphlet published that year it is set forth that the procession to Tyburn is a hideous mockery on the law. The final scene had lost its terrors. It taught no lesson of morality to the beholders, but tended to the encouragement of vice. The day of execution was deemed a public holiday, to which thousands thronged, many to gratify an unaccountable curiosity, more to seize an opportunity for committing fresh crimes. "If we take a view of the supposed solemnity from the time at which the criminal leaves the prison to the last moment of his existence, it will be found to be a period full of the most shocking and disgraceful circumstances. If the only defect were the want of ceremony, the minds of the spectators might be supposed to be left in a state of indifference. But when they view the meanness of the apparatus, the dirty cart, and ragged harness, surrounded by a sordid assemblage of the lowest among the vulgar, their sentiments are inclined more to ridicule than pity. The whole progress is attended with the same effect. Numbers soon thicken into a crowd of followers, and then an indecent levity is heard." The crowd gathered as it went, the levity increased, "till on reaching the fatal tree it became a riotous mob, and their wantonness of speech broke forth in profane jokes, swearing, and blasphemy." The officers of the law were powerless to check the tumult. No attention was paid to the convict's dying speech, "an exhortation to shun a vicious life, addressed to thieves actually engaged in picking pockets." The culprit's prayers were interrupted, his demeanour if resigned was sneered at, and only applauded when he went with brazen effrontery to his death. Thus, says the pamphlet, are all the ends of public justice defeated, all the effects of example, the terrors of death, the shame of punishment, are all lost. The evils it was hoped might be obviated, "were public executions conducted with becoming form and solemnity, if order were preserved, and every tendency to disturb it suppressed." Hence the place of execution was changed in 1784 from Tyburn to the great area that has lately been opened before Newgate. The sheriffs were doubtful of their power to make alterations, and consulted the judges, who gave it as their opinion that it was within the sheriffs' competence. "With this sanction, therefore," the sheriffs go on to say, "we have proceeded, and instead of carting the criminal through the streets to Tyburn, the sentence of death is executed in the front of Newgate, where upwards of 5,000 persons may easily assemble. Here a temporary scaffold hung with black is erected, and no other persons are permitted to ascend it than the necessary officers of justice, the clergyman, and the criminal, and the crowd is kept at a proper distance. During the whole time of the execution a funeral bell is tolled in Newgate, and the prisoners are kept in the strictest order." The horrors of executions were but little diminished by the substitution of the Old Bailey as the scene. 74 years were to elapse before the wisdom of legislators and the good sense of the public insisted that the extreme penalty of the law should be carried out in the strictest privacy within the walls of the gaol. CHAPTER 11.